The heavy oak doors of Iron Vale's strategic sanctuary did not keep out the damp chill of the approaching autumn, nor did they muffle the venomous murmurs of the men inside. Hidden completely within the deep recess of a stone pillar, Lyra kept her breathing shallow, her body motionless. 6 years of absolute devotion to this pack, of mapping their borders, training their elite vanguard, and loving her leader in quiet humility had taught her one vital skill: how to become invisible when necessary. Through the narrow gap in the masonry, she watched Croft, the corrupt elder council member, smoothing down his heavy leather tunic as he huddled with another senior advisor. Their voices were low, dripping with the casual cruelty of politicians who believed their decisions were untouchable. "The House of Avara has formally given its consent," Croft murmured, a sharp, scheming grin cutting through his weathered face. "Lady Neva will arrive before the first snow. Her father has agreed that the pure-blood alliance is paramount." "And the Alpha?" the other elder whispered, glancing toward the corridor. "What of his current arrangement?" "Darian initiated the courtship himself," Croft sneered, his voice cutting into Lyra like a shard of ice. "He knows that to claim the title of Alpha Prime, he needs a mate of ancient, immaculate lineage. Lyra is a commoner. Her human blood 3 generations back is a stain he can no longer afford to carry. The bond will be severed publicly to show his strength. It is a necessary restructuring for the purity of Iron Vale." Their heavy boots clicked against the stone floor as they walked away, leaving Lyra alone in the dark. She did not tremble. Her heart rate remained flat, a testament to the brutal discipline she had forced upon herself. But deep within her chest, her wolf, usually a quiet, muted presence, became entirely motionless. It was the stillness of a predator that had just scented danger and was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Darian Voss, the arrogant alpha she had bled for. The man who had slept soundly while she stayed up until dawn drafting the tactical maneuvers that won him his greatest victories, had traded her loyalty for political gain. The public betrayal happened at noon. Darian did not possess the decency to break their bond in private. Instead, he turned the sacred rite into a theatrical spectacle, summoning the entire pack to the Great Hall when it was at its fullest. When Lyra pushed open the heavy iron doors, the vast room fell into a suffocating, scripted silence. Hundreds of warriors and commoners lined the long wooden tables, some refusing to meet her gaze, while the high balcony was draped in silver silk. Sitting there, looking down with cold, aristocratic composure, was Lady Neva of House Avara. She was immaculate, a pure-blood noblewoman chosen to step into a life Lyra had built with her own sweat and blood. Darian stood at the center of the hall, looking every bit the ruthless politician he had become. His alpha mark burned dark against his throat, his posture rigid and commanding. As Lyra stopped 3 paces from him, he began to speak, using the ancient, formal cadence of the old tongue. Lyra felt a bitter, clarifying wave of irony wash over her. She was the one who had translated those very texts for him 2 winters ago. Now he was using her own intellectual labor to strip away her rank, her name, and her home. "Sarah Calloway came to us in a time of need," Darian announced, switching to the common tongue so his voice would carry to every corner of the room, playing the part of a merciful, reluctant leader. She served Iron Veil with dedication. But a true dynasty requires a matched foundation. It requires the weight of pure lineage to carry our legacy into the future. To keep her tied to a destiny she was never meant for would be a cruelty. This is not an exile. It is a release. Release. The word hung in the air like smoke. He was framing his betrayal as an act of charity, expecting her to be grateful for her own undoing. Lyra kept her chin high, her spine like steel. She chose absolute silence. She gave him no tears, no anger, and no plea to react against. She simply stared into his eyes with such steady, piercing clarity that Darien, the great alpha of Iron Veil, was the first to look away. A ripple of discomfort went through the crowd. Up in the silver gallery, Lady Neva's eyes narrowed slightly, noting the sudden shift in dignity. Lyra turned and walked out of the gates of Iron Veil, never looking back. The moment her boots crossed the outer boundary line, a torrential storm broke over the landscape. The rain came down in relentless, blinding sheets, washing the scent of the pack from her skin. Deep in her chest, the pack bond snapped. But instead of grief, a low, powerful growl vibrated behind her sternum. For the first time in her life, her wolf roared with a savage, unfamiliar recognition, as if a lock had finally been shattered. She walked for nearly an hour through the mud, her formal clothes soaked through, her identity completely erased. She had no pack, no title, and only a few coins in her pocket. But she had her mind, and she had her choices. She found him standing under the ruined archway of an abandoned stone gatehouse. Lyra almost missed him in the gray downpour, but her wolf reacted instantly, snapping to total attention. The man was massive, his presence recalibrating the space around him. He wore plain, dark traveling gear with no pack crests, standing with a loose, terrifyingly calm stance that signaled absolute lethargy and absolute danger. His face was severe, bisected by a jagged scar that ran from his left temple down to his jawline. When his eyes locked onto hers, they were the color of molten silver and stormlight. They stared at each other through the curtain of rain. Lyra did not know who he was, but she felt the fury of her betrayal turning into a desperate need to reclaim her own agency. She walked straight up to him, stopping mere inches from his chest. "Marry me," Lyra said, her voice cutting through the sound of the thunder. "Tonight. Right now, before I take another step down this road." The stranger did not flinch. He did not ask questions or laugh. He simply watched her with an intense, unreadable stillness. "I am not asking because I am broken," Lyra added, her silver eyes flashing. "I am asking because the last man who held my life decided I was not worth choosing, and I will make my own choice before this night ends." A subtle shift passed over the man's scarred face. Not pity, but a deep, unsettling sense of relief, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. "Yes," he replied, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to shake the very ground beneath her feet. "Then say the words," Lyra commanded. "Say something binding." Without a moment of hesitation, the stranger began to recite the ancient marriage vow. He did not use the rewritten rites of the modern pacts. He spoke the true old tongue, words so ancient and weighted that they seemed to alter the air around them. Lyra repeated the phrases after him, her voice steady and resolute. When the final syllable was spoken, he reached into his tunic and pressed a heavy, dark metal ring into her palm. "Come," he said simply, turning into the storm. "There is shelter ahead." That night, for the first time in 6 years, Lyra slept without dreams. The next morning, as the fog began to burn off the ridges, she followed her silent new husband over a steep crest. Below them lay a valley dominated by a colossal fortress of charcoal and bone-white stone, its towers rising into the sky with an indifferent, ancient permanence. It was Drazenvale, the legendary seat of absolute power. As Lyra looked down at the massive gates, which were thrown wide open in deliberate anticipation of their arrival, she felt a strange, quiet pressure behind her sternum. It wasn't fear. It was the whisper of a profound, hidden heritage waking up within her blood. Beside her stood Gideon, the feared warrior who had just bound his fate to hers, watching her with silver eyes that knew exactly who she was, even if she did not yet know it herself. The elder housekeeper greeted Gideon with a brief, synchronized nod of her head, then shifted her gaze directly to Lyra. In that instant, a profound transition altered her face. It was not a look of sudden astonishment. That was the primary detail Lyra registered, a piece of reality that sat crooked in her mind, like a portrait hung unevenly on a stone wall. The woman's features did not register shock. Instead, they settled into the quiet, deep exhalation of an individual who had survived a grueling, decades-long wait for a specific proclamation and had finally received confirmation. "Welcome to Drazenvale," the woman intoned, her voice perfectly level, thoroughly composed, and strictly formal. She turned immediately to orchestrate the movements of the lower-tier household servants, and as her wool-cloaked frame passed close enough to Lyra that the contact was clearly intentional, she muttered a phrase barely louder than a breath through teeth. "The true heir of the Light Dynasty returns." Lyra snapped her head around to look at her, but the housekeeper was already moving away, projecting sharp, authoritative orders to the domestic staff with detached professionalism, her face revealing absolutely nothing more. The words seemed instantly swallowed by her duty. Lyra looked up at Gideon. He was observing her with those unreadable, stormy silver eyes, and she possessed the distinct impression that he had captured every single syllable and had made the conscious, deliberate choice to offer no commentary whatsoever. The eastern corridor was where the first shift manifested. A silent servant was guiding Lyra toward her designated chambers, leading her through the cavernous main hall, up a massive, sweeping staircase, and down a wide passage that spanned the entire length of the eastern wing. The corridor was flanked by ancient iron sconces, each fitted with protective wards for illumination, the archaic kind Lyra recognized from her studies, which were activated exclusively by bloodline resonance and maintained by the physical proximity of a recognized royal family member. They had clearly been dark for generations. She could see the heavy blankets of dust clinging to the ironwork. She was exactly 3 paces past the first dormant bracket when it violently ignited. It did not flicker or struggle with a dim catch. It surged with full, warm, immediate brilliance, as though it had simply been waiting for the rightful presence to step beneath its frame. The sconce directly behind her caught fire next, then the one following, and the next, like a falling chain of silent recognitions. Each bracket burst into gold and silver flames as her shadow passed beneath them, illuminating the dark corridor in her wake all the way back to the grand staircase. The servant guiding her stopped dead in her tracks. Lyra halted as well, turning her body to survey the corridor. Every single iron sconce was ablaze. The dust on the metal fittings was now vividly illuminated in the warm radiance. The entire eastern wing glowing in a manner it clearly hadn't achieved in an age. The servant said nothing. Her expression mirrored the one Lyra had witnessed on the head of the household. Not surprise, but something far older, an ancient acknowledgement. "The wards," Lyra murmured carefully, her voice echoing off the timber. "How long have they been cold?" The servant met her eyes for a fractured second, then immediately locked her gaze straight ahead. "I will show you to your quarters, my lady," she replied. The heavily sealed door sat at the furthest boundary of the east wing. Lyra discovered it later that evening, walking the corridor completely unescorted, an exploration Gideon had neither discouraged nor accompanied. He granted her physical space in the exact manner he granted her his silence, entirely, without any perceptible effort, as if he had already mapped out a grand design and was merely waiting for the pieces to slide into place. This particular door was set slightly recessed from the others, framed by heavy blocks of granite carved with intricate, interlocking sigils she did not recognize. It was locked not by an iron mechanism, but by something far more primordial, a ward of absolute closure. The dark seam where the timber met the stone frame looked cold, rigid, and long-held. She did not lay a finger on it. She merely stood in front of the threshold, and the wood trembled. It wasn't the masonry of the castle or the floorboards beneath her boots. It was the door itself. A faint, nearly imperceptible vibration thrummed through the oak and stone, a romantic werewolf tale. Like a tuning fork resonating to a precise frequency it had spent lifetimes waiting to receive. Lyra remained utterly motionless and felt her inner wolf stir violently within her chest, pressing forward with a sudden, sharp intensity. A wide-awake hunger for an inheritance she could not yet explicitly name. She took a step back. She turned. Gideon was standing at the absolute opposite end of the long corridor. She had no tracking of how long his shadow had been cast there. He was leaning casually against the opposing stone wall, his muscular arms loosely crossed over his leather breastplate, watching her with an expression that was remarkably patient, careful, and sealed just as tightly as the ancient door before her. Yet beneath that rigid composure, in the tight set of his jaw and the absolute stillness of his scarred hands, lay the unmistakable shadow of a man carrying a very old, very quiet grief. What is hidden behind that threshold? She demanded across the space. History, Gideon replied, his deep voice. The ensuing silence stretched long enough to serve as its own distinct answer. "Rest for now," he said instead, stepping away from the wall. "We will speak on these matters tomorrow." Lyra studied him for a long, heavy moment. Then she cast one final look back at the door, which had fallen perfectly still again, quiet, as though it too had resolved to wait for the proper hour. She walked back to her bedchamber. She did not sleep for hours. In the absolute blackness of the room, Her wolf remained wide awake beside her, patient, certain, and pointing like an unyielding compass toward a destiny Lyra could not yet see. Lyra had always possessed a far sharper mind for investigation than anyone in her past had ever credited her for. That was the hidden benefit of being consistently, structurally underestimated by individuals who perceived only her commoner status before they ever looked at her intellect. It rendered her invisible in incredibly useful ways. Powerful people never guarded their speech carefully around women they dismissed as mere background decorations. They never barred their records rooms against an exile they had categorized as utterly peripheral to the pack's survival. 6 grueling years inside the Iron Veil territory had taught her exactly how much intelligence could be gathered by a person the room had already completely dismissed. She initiated her search in the Stronghold's library. The Drazenvile archives occupied the entire cavernous lower level of the North Tower, stretching from the flagstones to the vaulted ceiling with towering shelves of blackened timber. The air was thick with the scent of ancient parchment and decaying leather. Documents that had been accumulating far longer than any living wolf could remember. It was organized with the obsessive, clinical precision of a royal lineage that treated its own historical trajectory with absolute gravity. There were census rolls, border treaty documents, and blood registry scrolls stretching back over 4 centuries. Pack Alliance documents were cataloged by the decade, meticulously cross-referenced by aristocratic house. Lyra was methodical, using her fingers to trace the fading ink. She did not know precisely what hidden truth she was hunting for, which meant she was forced to examine everything. She began her extraction with the house records of Avara. The House of Avara was old, far older than most contemporary alphas cared to map out. Their alliance chronicle was extensive, calculating, and heavily strategic. Every single union across their lineage had been explicitly chosen to consolidate political influence rather than raw physical territory. Deciphering their treaty records was akin to watching an ancient dynasty play a very long, multi-generational chess game. The specific entries regarding the Iron Veil Pack appeared exactly twice. The first was a minor trade agreement executed 30 years ago. Then, precisely 22 years ago, a completely different document emerged. It was a scroll filed not under a standard pack alliance, but under a protection covenant. It was heavily sealed. The archivist's filing notation read simply, "Terms classified by mutual consent of both houses and the Lycan Neutral Court." Lyra sat in the dim candlelight with that note for a long moment. Classified by mutual consent meant both opposing parties had explicitly agreed to lock the record away forever, which inherently meant both parties possessed something massive to conceal. She cross-referenced that exact date from 22 years ago with the official Iron Veil Pack census she had pulled from an adjacent shelf. It was a standard census, recorded and sworn annually. She slid her finger down the long column of registered pack members for that specific year, and then the year immediately following. One single entry had been completely removed. It wasn't merely redacted or inked over, it was physically excised. The heavy paper had been cut out with surgical, precise blade strokes, leaving nothing behind but the ghostly outline of a margin where an entire life had been sliced from the pack's history. Someone had been systematically erased from existence. Lyra recorded the page number, the exact vertical position of the missing entry, and the specific date range. Feeling the cold, piercing clarity of a strategist who has just uncovered not a final answer, but the distinct shape of a conspiracy. It was the negative space of a massive secret, something that had absolutely been present and was now deliberately absent. She closed the heavy census book and opened the regional records of the Lycan-neutral court from that identical calendar year. There, written in dry, detached legal syntax and filed under the category of extraordinary protections and royal placements, she found it. One minor of unspecified lineage, female, placed with a consenting family unit within Iron Veil Pack territory under the strict terms of the Avara Iron Veil Covenant. Identity sealed by supreme order of both high houses. Duration indefinite, pending the ultimate dissolution of a protective curse. Filed under the binding authority of the Lycan-neutral court arbitration, year 214. Lyra read the legal script 3 times over, her breath catching in her throat. A child had been traded and hidden away within Iron Veil territory 22 years ago. Her true identity completely locked away, shielded from the world by a defensive curse. She set the parchment down onto the oak table with extreme care. She herself had been brought to the gates of Iron Veil as an infant, her parents supposedly slaughtered before she possessed a single cohesive memory. She had been fed a narrative of tragedy, a border family wiped out by a rogue assault, a charitable pack taking in a commoner orphan out of sheer moral obligation. She had never possessed a reason to question the fundamental architecture of that story. She possessed an undeniable reason now. She sat motionless in the deep shadows of the archive for a long time, while the terrifying implications of the text arranged themselves around her mind in a slow, cataclysmic sequence. She was still paralyzed there when the thunderous sound of heavy, iron-shod wheels and carriage horses echoed into the outer cobblestone courtyard. She heard his distinct voice before she ever caught sight of him. Darian's voice carried through the stone corridors in the exact manner it always had. That highly cultivated, booming resonance engineered specifically to dominate rooms and project absolute authority into whatever space he walked into. The sound cut straight through the archive's high, narrow slit window, and Lyra's body reacted instinctively before her intellect could suppress the conditioning. Her entire muscular system tightened. It was 6 years of psychological submission, responding to a familiar, toxic frequency. She swiftly closed the ancient documents, returned them with perfect precision to their designated slots on the shelves, and smoothed her facial features into the unreadable mask of cold composure she had perfected the morning before her public exile. Then she stood up to confront them. The grand reception hall was already packed with bodies when she crossed the threshold. Gideon stood near a towering arched window, engaged in a low, intense conversation with 2 of his senior military court advisors. The aristocratic Avara delegation was clustered near the main entrance, Lady Neva flanked by her 2 high-ranking noble attendants, and Darian, who was currently speaking to a Drazen Vale official in that practiced, overly expansive manner he utilized whenever he was performing absolute confidence, rather than actually feeling it. Lyra stepped silently into the light of the room. Darian's eyes scanned the space and found her. She watched the reaction manifest in real time. She witnessed the exact microsecond his gaze locked onto her figure in the doorway, and his mind fully processed what his eyes were seeing. She had fully anticipated raw fury. She had mentally braced herself for the icy, vindictive wrath of an alpha, confronted with undeniable evidence that the woman he had publicly discarded had somehow landed in a position immeasurably higher than he had intended. What she saw instead was pure, unadulterated fear. It wasn't a performed political concern or strategic alarm. It was clean, primal, instinctive terror, instantly suppressed. But it was too late. She had already witnessed it. It vanished in a heartbeat, replaced by the smooth, neutral facade of a politician who had spent his entire life managing his outer reactions. But the fear had undeniably been there. She catalogued it in her mind, leaving it untouched for the moment. Then her eyes shifted to Neva. Lady Neva of House Avara had not moved an inch. She stood slightly separated from her noble attendants, tracking Lyra with an expression that was thoroughly impossible to read. Complexly layered in a fashion that required several seconds to dissect. Guilt was woven into her features, half buried beneath an armor of aristocratic self-control. And beneath that guilt lay something far colder, far more calculated. It was political calculation, without question. But toward what ultimate end? Lyra could not yet fathom it. She was denied the time to analyze it further, as Gideon had already crossed the stone floor. He moved without the slightest hint of hurry or theatrical announcement. A romantic werewolf, simply redirecting his massive frame from his prior conversation to her immediate side in a manner that appeared entirely natural, yet was, she strongly suspected, completely intentional. He stopped directly beside her, closer than standard court courtesy dictated, and when he spoke, his deep baritone was pitched strictly for her ears. "You unearthed something in the dark," he murmured. It was a flat statement, not an inquiry. "Several somethings," she replied under her breath, keeping her eyes fixed forward. "I am aware," Gideon said, his silver gaze anchored on the opposing crowd. "Do not allow them to perceive that you are hunting for answers." A brief, heavily weighted pause ensued. "Let them believe you have already uncovered everything." Lyra absorbed the strategy, turning it over in her mind. It was exceptional tactical advice. It was also the explicit advice of a warrior who understood precisely what secrets she was digging up and had made the conscious choice, once again, not to simply hand her the answers. She catalogued that detail as well. She looked across the chamber at Darian, who had fully recovered his aristocratic composure and was now tracking her with intensely careful, calculating eyes, and then at Neva, who had not broken eye contact once. Lyra carefully arranged her own expression into a posture she had mastered through 6 years of surviving Ironvale politics. Absolute, unassailable certainty. She would let them believe the entire game was already lost. She would force them to spend the duration of this royal summit agonizing over exactly how much leverage she held. She was still piecing the grand puzzle together herself, but they had absolutely no need to know that. Not yet. The mandatory ritual census was formally announced over the morning meal the following dawn. A necessary legal formality, the court herald proclaimed to the assembled hall. A standard protocol executed at every high summit convened under the binding jurisdiction of the Lycan Neutral Court. Every single individual present within the stronghold whether an elite guest or a permanent resident, would be required to submit to a formal bloodline verification before the day's official political proceedings could commence. The verified results would be explicitly detailed, witnessed by legal authorities, and permanently filed with the neutral court to establish the summit's official record. Lyra listened to the herald's booming announcement and felt no initial trepidation. She had submitted to standard pack census verifications multiple times in her youth. It was a routine practice in Iron Vale, executed every winter. It required a minor, superficial slice to the palm of the hand, followed by pressing a drop of blood into a consecrated ritual flame. The magical fire read the unique blood resonance of the wolf and instantly produced a vivid color corresponding to their precise lineage classification. Purebred noble bloodlines caused the flame to burn a deep, saturated crimson. Mixed heritage produced shifting variations of amber and dark copper. Human-touched commoner bloodlines burned a pale, steady, unremarkable orange. Lyra had burned pale orange her entire life. She knew exactly what her blood was. Or at least, she thought she did. She took her designated place in the growing line of court members filling the great hall, sandwiching herself between a high-ranking Drazenvale advisor and one of Lady Neva's personal handmaidens, and waited. The elder conducting the blood census was ancient, possessing the weathered look of an individual who had long since ceased tracking calendar years because time had lost all practical utility. He advanced down the line of bodies with the detached efficiency of a priest who had executed this exact ritual thousands of times across his lifespan. He carried a shallow, heavy iron basin in which a small, brilliant flame danced with no visible source of fuel, a sacred lichen working flame. Completely self-sustaining and perfectly calibrated to decipher bloodline resonance with the absolute precision of centuries of refinement. Lyra watched his slow, rhythmic progress down the line. Darian stepped forward and produced a deep, heavily saturated crimson flame, distinct with the unmistakable blue undertone that verified the Voss bloodline's pure blood status. He noted his own glowing result with a visible flash of arrogant satisfaction before stepping aside to let the line advance. Neva's blood was introduced next, and it caused the basin to erupt into a pure crimson, so dark it appeared nearly black, the concentrated, undeniable result of an aristocratic lineage that had been deliberately, systematically kept pure across generations without a single misstep. Even the ancient elder paused slightly over the sight, carefully recording a notation into his heavy ledger with the meticulousness of an archivist documenting an exceptional specimen. Then the old man stood directly before Lyra. She calmly extended her open palm. The small ritual blade he held was icy against her skin. The incision was shallow, a practiced and painless nick. She held her hand over the iron basin and allowed 3 heavy drops of dark blood to fall directly into the center of the flame. The fire instantly went out. For one agonizing, suspended second of absolute silence, there was nothing. Just a total absence of light where the flame had been, a single thin curl of gray smoke rising into the rafters, and the collective, terrified breath of every noble in the great hall hanging in the air. Then the fire returned with a vengeance. It was not orange. It was not amber. It bore absolutely no resemblance to any color Lyra had produced in 23 years of routine pack verifications. Gold and silver fire erupted from the iron bowl, burning together in an intertwined, inseparable dance. The gold was as blindingly warm as a midday sun, and the silver was as piercingly cool as midnight, twisting around one another within the shallow basin in a manner that looked far less like standard fire and far more like a sentient, living entity. It did not flicker or waver. It burned with a steady, unyielding certainty, impossibly bright for a flame sourced from a mere 3 drops of blood. The entire great hall had devolved into a state of perfect, petrified stillness. Lyra stared down at the blinding light. The ancient elder's hand, she noticed, at the very periphery of her vision, had frozen completely mid-air above his parchment ledger. She turned her head slightly to look at his face and discovered that every ounce of color had been violently drained from his features. He had gone utterly pale all at once, as if an invisible force had pulled the vital fluid directly out of his flesh. His ancient eyes darted wildly from the gold and silver fire to Lyra's face, and then snapped back to the basin. In his gaze, there was no confusion whatsoever. There was only the stunned, the terrified expression of a man who had suddenly encountered a living myth he had been assured no longer existed on this earth. He recovered his professional composure with remarkable speed. He reached out with a trembling hand and slammed the heavy ledger shut before the young scribe seated beside him could write down a single word of the result. A motion executed so smoothly it might have appeared routine to anyone who wasn't specifically analyzing his body language. He then looked out at the silent hall, scanning the gathered court members and the stunned summit guests, some of whom were leaning over the railings, others exchanging frantic whispers, most of them desperately trying to decipher whether their eyes had actually witnessed what they thought they had. The elder cleared his throat and spoke in a perfectly level, projected voice, a technical irregularity with the basin. This specific registration will be concluded privately in the inner chambers. He swiftly gathered the iron bowl of gold and silver fire. He collected the ledger under his arm. He walked away from the center of the hall without meeting the gaze of a single soul in the room. Lyra immediately sought out Gideon. She located his massive frame instantly. He was standing like a statue at the far edge of the stone hall, exactly where he had been positioned since the start of the census. And he was staring directly at her, with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It lasted for only a solitary, a fractured moment, a sharp break in the impenetrable armor of composure he wore as constantly and naturally as his own skin. And through that brief fracture, clearly and completely, she witnessed it all at once. A devastating mixture of profound grief, deep-seated guilt, and a terrifying truth buried beneath the surface. The private, internal shift that had occurred between them in that fractured instant was something incredibly ancient, heavily guarded, and deeply aching. Lyra could find no proper name for it yet, though if she allowed herself absolute honesty, it bore the unmistakable shape of a warrior, witnessing the return of something precious he had long since ceased believing he would ever see alive again. Then, just as quickly as it had surfaced, the fracture closed. Gideon looked away from her. His cold, unreadable composure returned seamlessly, locking back into place like iron plates. He turned smoothly to speak with a passing court advisor, as though nothing out of the ordinary had transpired. But Lyra had seen it. She kept that fragile revelation locked tight within her own mind, uttering not a single word to anyone. She spent the remainder of that grueling afternoon walking through the formal proceedings of the diplomatic summit with an impassive face that revealed absolutely nothing. Even as her mind raced furiously beneath her calm exterior, she went to the secluded East Wing that very night. She had not originally planned to do so. She had returned to her assigned guest quarters, sat heavily on the edge of the mattress, and tried to force herself to think logically about gold and silver fires, sealed dynastic documents, and a royal child deliberately erased from an official census record. After an hour of staring blankly into the shadows, she found herself standing in the cold stone length of the East Corridor once more, without any conscious memory of making the decision to walk there. The heavy oak door trembled slightly as she approached, echoing the strange vibration she had felt once before. This time, she reached out and touched the ancient wood. The defensive ward of absolute closure resisted her instantly. She felt it as a physical weight, a dense, thrumming pressure pushing back against her palm, old and firmly set by powerful magic. Yet beneath that stubborn resistance, something else stirred. It was an immediate, subtle recognition, like a complex lock suddenly encountering its long-lost key and beginning to open. Against decades of stubborn habit, to consider turning open, Lyra pressed her palm completely flat against the rough wood. The ancient ward did not shatter, but a section of the stone wall immediately beside the door paneling, a section she had previously assumed to be entirely structural and unremarkable, shifted inward. It moved just slightly. It was just enough to reveal the dust-covered edge of an object hidden deep within the recess. She worked at it with careful, deliberate movements, guiding the old wooden panel as it turned on hinges that had not tasted oil in generations, until she could see exactly what lay concealed behind the stone. It was an oil painting. It had been hidden away, perhaps with intense deliberation, or perhaps simply lost to decades of sealed doors, forgotten histories, and deliberately avoided corridors. The noblewoman captured in the portrait possessed Lyra's exact, distinct jawline. She had Lyra's dark, steady eyes, set at precisely the same defiant angle. She was significantly younger in the portrait than Lyra was now, and she wore the sweeping royal robes of the Light Dynasty, rendered in a deep, majestic midnight blue. Cradled protectively in her arms was a tightly wrapped infant with a thick thatch of dark hair and a tiny face far too new to read. The woman was not smiling in the stiff, manufactured manner of people who perform happiness for a court painter. She was smiling in a private, deeply overwhelmed way, as if she were feeling an emotion far too vast for public expression. Beneath the canvas, fixed to a small plate of tarnished silver, were the engraved words, "Lyra of the Light Dynasty, first daughter, taken." Lyra stood frozen in front of the image for an exceptionally long time. Outside the fortress, the high fantasy night was perfectly quiet. The long corridor was bathed in the warm, flickering glow of gold and silver flame, the wall sconces burning steady and bright. Beside her, The ancient door trembled faintly once more, as though something trapped on the other side had been waiting a very long time to finally be found. She pressed her hand against the wood one more time, very gently. I know, she thought, though she was not yet entirely certain what it was she truly knew. She only understood that everything she had ever believed about her own identity was built upon a foundation someone had very deliberately laid in secret. And that foundation was nothing like the lie she had been told her entire life. He was waiting for her in the tactical map room. Not in her personal quarters, not in the bustling great hall, and not in any of the formal diplomatic spaces that the summit had aggressively colonized with intense politics and empty performances. The map room was small and cramped, tucked away behind the grand library on the north side of the sprawling palace. It was a functioning, working room, its stone walls entirely covered in fading territorial charts, troop movements, and old regional survey documents. A single long table occupied its center, its dark timber deeply scarred by decades of heavy military use. There were only 2 chairs. A roaring fire had been burning long enough to have settled into a steady, deeply reliable warmth. Gideon was standing rigidly at the narrow window when she entered the room. His massive back was turned to the door, his gaze fixed out on the pitch-black courtyard below. He did not turn around immediately. He allowed her to cross the stone floor, allowed her to take in the tight confines of the space, and let her choose exactly where she wished to stand. She chose the far end of the long table, a position where she could keep both him and the exit clearly within her line of sight. 6 years of survival within the Iron Veil pack had made certain spatial habits permanently defensive. "You found the portrait," Gideon said, his deep voice low, still refusing to turn around. "Yes," Lyra answered. "And you witnessed the silver flame." "Yes." He turned then. He looked at her with the exact same intensity he had displayed in the census hall, but the fracture was entirely gone this time. There was no grief surfacing, no guilt retreating into the shadows of his mind. He had clearly made a definitive decision between that moment and now. She could read it in the rigid, unyielding set of his massive shoulders. He had decided to stop managing exactly what she was allowed to see. "Sit down," he said quietly, his tone carrying a rare, soft weight. "Please." Lyra sat. He remained standing for a silent moment, then seemed to reconsider his imposing posture, and took the chair directly across from her. The dancing firelight moved between them, and the small room became suffocatingly still. "I need you to let me finish everything I have to say before you speak," Gideon murmured. "Not because I am begging you for an ounce of mercy. I ask it because what I must tell you has a specific, terrible shape, and if I am forced to stop in the middle of it, I am not certain I will ever find my way back to the rest of the truth." She looked at him with absolute steadiness. "Then, tell it." He told her everything. 23 years ago, the Light Dynasty bloodline was plunged into a catastrophic crisis, Gideon explained. It was not a mere political dispute. It was something far older and infinitely more dangerous. It was a brutal bloodline challenge, born from within the inner circles of the High Court itself. A powerful rival faction emerged, claiming that the throne had been held through entirely illegitimate succession. They demanded an immediate, absolute verification of the royal line's purity and right to rule. He leaned slightly forward, the fire casting harsh shadows across his rugged features. The challenge had real teeth. There were ancient documents produced, forged or otherwise, and there were powerful council members entirely willing to believe them. There was a genuine, terrifying uncertainty about how the challenge would ultimately resolve. The reigning monarch had 2 children at the time. A son, 12 years old, who was already being rigorously prepared for eventual succession, and a newborn daughter, barely 8 months old, whose secret existence was known only to the innermost circle of the royal household. The rival factions' explicit strategy, should they successfully seize the throne, was total annihilation. They would show no mercy to royal blood, children included. Gideon's voice remained perfectly even, careful and detached. It was the voice of a warrior, recounting a trauma they have rehearsed so many times that the bleeding edges have been worn down to something manageable. The Iron Veil Pack bloodline, specifically the Alpha ruling at that time, who was Darien's grandfather, possessed deep historical ties to the neutral courts. He wielded an immense amount of political influence that could effectively slow the rival challenge down. He could buy us critical time, introducing endless procedural obstacles while the Crown stabilized the volatile political situation. The Alpha was entirely willing to use that influence, but he required an extraordinary price in return. A child, Lyra whispered, her breath catching in her throat. A guarantee, Gideon corrected firmly. Something so profound that it would bind both families to absolute secrecy indefinitely. An arrangement that neither side could ever expose without completely destroying themselves. He paused, his gaze dropping to the scarred wood of the table. The monarch agreed to place his infant daughter directly within the Iron Veil Pack's remote territory. She was to be hidden, completely unregistered. Her true royal nature heavily suppressed by a dark curse designed by the neutral court's own practitioners. She would live out her life believing she was nothing more than a commoner she-wolf. She would be unknown, untraceable, and utterly invisible. And she would remain trapped in that diminished state until the curse was formally dissolved. How was it designed to be dissolved? Lyra demanded. A true, absolute severance, Gideon said. A mate bond freely given out of genuine emotion, not arranged, not political, that was violently broken by public rejection. His jaw shifted tightly. The suppression curse was intricately designed around the theory that only genuine emotional choice could ever constitute the trigger. It had to be something that could never be manufactured, faked, or coerced. A real bond voluntarily made, and then genuinely, ruthlessly destroyed by the other party. He looked directly into her eyes. Darien's public rejection of you in the Great Hall was not simply an act of standard pack cruelty, Lyra. It was surgically precise. Whether he truly knew the deeper implications of his actions or not, and I firmly believe he remained entirely ignorant, the exact form of his betrayal met every single condition of the ancient magic. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Lyra sat perfectly still as his words washed over her, feeling the truth move through her in heavy, freezing layers. It was the way deep winter cold moved, not striking all at once, but progressively claiming the body, each layer landing with its own distinct shock. The dormant wolf that had violently awoken within her out in the pouring rain. The ancient royal wards that had lit up like stars the moment she walked beneath them. The gold and silver flame exploding within the census bowl. The hidden portrait of a regal woman possessing her exact face, bearing a name that was not quite hers, and yet entirely hers to claim. Lyra of the Light Dynasty. First daughter, taken. She was only 8 months old, Lyra said, her voice barely audible. Yes, and you were 12 years old. A flash of unadulterated agony crossed Gideon's face before he mastered it. Yes, you stood there and watched them take her away. The heavy, oppressive silence that followed her statement was its own definitive answer. She did not need him to verbally confirm the memory. She sat with the monstrous shape of it, enduring the full, crushing weight of 23 years of deception, and did not speak for a very long time. The fire burned steady. The stone room held perfectly still around them. Gideon waited, and Lyra understood completely now why his patience was always so absolute, so terrifyingly unyielding. The man had been waiting for this exact conversation to happen for over 2 decades. He knew precisely how to wait out a storm. She was no longer the same broken woman who had walked through Iron Vale's gates 3 days ago. She could feel that truth, plainly, factually, without an ounce of unneeded drama. That previous woman had known exactly who she was, an unappreciated commoner strategist. This new woman was sitting across from a feared warrior who had just revealed that she belonged to the Light Dynasty, that she was a hidden heir, and that the entire architecture of her existence had been constructed by other people's desperation. Her whole life had been sustained by a cruel curse that had dissolved in the torrential rain outside a border town. The moment the arrogant alpha she had once loved cast her out in front of a mocking audience. She thought bitterly about the Iron Vale pack. She thought of her 6 long years of being immensely useful, but never deemed worthy. She thought of bleeding in brutal border wars for a pure-blood lineage that had been paid handsomely in political capital just to hide her away in the shadows. She thought of the open road, the raging storm, the collapsed archway, and the massive, feared beta who had accepted her impulsive proposal without a single condition. She looked up, fixing her gaze tightly on Gideon. "Did you know," she asked, each word cutting through the quiet air like a blade, "exactly who I was when I proposed to you out in the rain?" The question landed heavily in the small room and hung there between them. Gideon looked at her, and for the very first time since she had known him, she watched him face something he could not masterfully manage, redirect, or simply wait out. His expression did not shatter this time. It simply became utterly, deathly still. It was the stillness of a man standing at the exact precipice of a truth he had spent his entire life carrying. Suddenly discovering that the distance between holding the secret and releasing it was infinitely smaller than he had prepared for. He did not answer her immediately. That agonizing silence was its own profound confession. And within that silence, Lyra understood several massive things all at once. Revelations she would spend the coming days deciding exactly what to do with. She realized that he had been actively looking for her. She realized that the storm, the ruined archway, and her presence on that specific border road had been no mere coincidence. She realized that his sudden compliance in the rain had not been impulsive, merciful, or strange. He had known exactly who she was from the very beginning, yet he had said yes anyway, deliberately stepping aside to let her believe it was entirely her own independent choice. She held that realization tight. It was a deeply complicated, bitter thing to hold. "Get out," she said quietly, her voice cold. "Please, I need this room alone." He stood up immediately. There was no desperate argument, no defensive explanation, and no pathetic request for her understanding. He crossed the stone floor toward the exit and paused, placing his massive hand heavily upon the wooden frame. "I know," he said, his voice rough, "but my knowing does not make the lie any smaller." Then he left, closing the door softly behind him. She sat completely alone in the map room with the dying fire, bearing the unmanaged weight of 23 years of someone else's carefully guarded secret. And for the absolute first time since the heavy iron gates of Ironvale had closed behind her, she finally let herself feel the entirety of it. Every single broken piece. She gave herself exactly one night. One single night in the dark map room with the embers and the truth and the full crushing weight of everything she now knew. She did not sleep a wink. She did not perform a single second of composure for the benefit of anyone else. She sat alone with the raw grief, the consuming fury, and the disorienting vertigo of a woman discovering that the very ground she had been standing on her entire life was actually someone else's calculated architecture. She allowed herself to feel it completely, because she had learned through 6 miserable years of serving Ironvale exactly what happened to emotions that were managed and suppressed instead of faced. They became structural. They held a terrible weight they were never meant to carry, quietly and invisibly, until something inside completely collapsed. She felt every ounce of the pain. Then, when the fire had burned down to cold ash and the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the narrow window, she stood up, straightened her clothes, and immediately began to work. She sent out the formal summons herself. She did not route them through Gideon's court heralds, nor did she utilize any of the existing administrative channels that would have forced her requests through layers of pre-existing authority. She wrote 4 separate, distinct documents entirely in her own sharp handwriting. She sealed each one firmly, using the heavy signet ring she had been carrying in her pocket since the morning she woke up and discovered the intricate crown engraved upon its face. She sought out a junior staff member she had briefly spoken with twice, someone she had internally assessed as both highly competent and fiercely discreet, and ordered him to deliver the letters before the summit's official morning session could convene. Gideon received his summons while isolated in his private study. Darian received his within his luxurious guest quarters. Neva received hers directly at her breakfast table. The corrupt Elder Croft, who had conducted the falsified census and who had not left the estate as Lyra might have expected, but had instead remained in quiet residence in the North Wing. received his summons in the deep archive. The very place where she suspected he had spent the night, desperately reviewing the historical records she had pulled 2 days prior. The summons stated the exact same message to all 4 of them. The East Council Chamber, 1 hour. Attendance is not optional. She did not sign the documents with her commoner name. She signed them clearly with the ancient name discovered on the hidden portrait, Lyra of the Light Dynasty. They came. She was already calmly seated at the head of the long council table when they arrived. The critical documents were meticulously arranged before her with the surgical precision of a military strategist who had spent the pre-dawn hours organizing them into an airtight argument. One that could not be dismantled by sudden interruption or clever political maneuvering. The ancient blood records from the hidden archive lay open. The formal neutral court filings were stacked neatly. The census page, with its surgically removed entry, sat exposed, alongside a complete copy of the Avara Iron Veil Protection Covenant, which she had flawlessly transcribed entirely from memory the previous night, and positioned directly at the center of the table, where everyone was forced to look at it, sat the portrait. Removed from its wall hiding place, the silver nameplate still attached. Lyra of the Light Dynasty, first daughter, taken. Gideon silently took a seat to her immediate left without waiting to be directed. He folded his massive hands flat on the table and uttered nothing. His expression was one she was rapidly coming to understand as his personal version of absolute attention. Completely still, entirely present, and utterly without any hidden agenda. Darian sat directly across from her. He stared at the oil painting for a long, agonizing moment, before finally raising his eyes to meet Lyra's gaze. The deep, lingering fear she had initially spotted in the reception hall had not left his aristocratic face. It had simply been compressed, heavily managed, and hidden beneath the thin veneer of political composure he had been rigorously trained since childhood to maintain. But the terror was absolutely there. She could see it clearly now, the way she could see anything she had spent 6 years specifically looking for. Neva sat gracefully at the far end of the long table, deliberately looking at no one. Her manicured hands were folded quietly in her lap, her posture immaculate. She bore the unmistakable expression of a noblewoman who had been anxiously anticipating this specific confrontation for a very long time. Elder Croft sat quietly in his chair. He looked, if anything, strangely relieved that the secret was out. "I am not calling this meeting to celebrate a grand revelation," Lyra stated. Her voice filled the stone chamber without the slightest hint of effort, steady, unhurried. The voice of a commander who had decided exactly what she was going to say and possessed zero interest in being redirected from her path. "I am not calling it to be officially recognized by this court, nor am I asking to be placed ceremonially into a royal position I never requested. I am calling this meeting because there are powerful legal agreements sitting in this room that were made directly over my body, about my life, completely without my knowledge or my consent, and I intend to address every single one of them before this summit closes." She opened the first document on the stack. She started directly with the Corrupt Protection Covenant. She walked through its hidden terms, explaining precisely what had been agreed upon, what each guilty party had received, and what each party had willingly surrendered. She delivered the breakdown without a hint of heat, without open accusation, relying entirely on the informational tone of a magistrate reading cold evidence into a public record. She noted the immense compensation the Iron Veil Pack bloodline had received. She noted the neutral court's illegal facilitation. She explicitly highlighted that absolutely no provision had ever been made for the child's knowledge or consent regarding her own forced placement. Because within the flawed legal framework of 23 years ago, an 8-month-old infant's future consent was not considered a relevant variable. It will be considered entirely relevant now, Lyra said, her voice dropping an octave. I am formally registering my absolute objection to the original terms. And I am officially opening an immediate renegotiation of every single benefit the Iron Veil Pack bloodline received under this corrupt covenant. Darian's jaw tightened violently, a vein throbbing in his temple. You have absolutely no legal standing to challenge. I possess the official blood record, she interrupted him simply, waving a hand over the parchment. I possess the hidden neutral court filing. I possess a physical census document from which my existence was deliberately and surgically removed, which constitutes a severe falsification offense under neutral court statute. She paused, letting the legal threat hang in the air. Your grandfather's explicit offense, Darian, not yours. I am noting that distinction for the record. But the massive benefits your bloodline accrued from that covenant, including the immense political capital that funded your father's alpha claim, and, subsequently, your own current position, those are directly relevant to your current Alpha Prime bid. She watched him closely, seeing the exact moment he understood the trap she had sprung. The prestigious Alpha Prime bid strictly required a perfectly clean record of entirely legitimate succession. If the political capital underpinning 2 entire generations of the Voss line's rise could be officially traced to a corrupt covenant now undergoing a formal legal challenge, the challenge would immediately reach the succession records. The neutral court would freeze his bid pending a multi-year review. Darian sat perfectly still, his face draining of color. The Avara Alliance, Lyra continued smoothly, turning her gaze toward Neva. The war was explicitly structured to permanently seal this covenant and prevent this exact conversation from ever happening. Lady Neva. She spoke the name without a shred of cruelty, without any bitter edge. Your noble house has carried this dark secret for 23 years. I am not demanding a full accounting of that choice today. I am, however, noting formally that the political foundation of your alliance with Iron Veil is now part of an open court challenge. And any marriage agreements predicated on its continuation are hereby suspended, pending a final resolution. Neva looked up, meeting Lyra's eyes for the absolute first time since sitting down. Her expression was a complex, layered thing, guilt, sharp calculation, and something deeply vulnerable buried beneath both. But she gave a single nod. It was one short, unambiguous acknowledgement of defeat. Gideon had not moved a single inch. Lyra could feel his intense gaze watching her the exact way she could feel the heat radiating from the fireplace on her left, steadily, from a fixed point, with a quality of absolute attention that never wavered or shifted. She did not look back at him. Not yet. She worked through the remainder of the documents with methodical precision. She detailed the census falsification. She presented the ward suppression records she had uncovered on the lower shelves of the archive, detailing the exact, cruel construction of the curse. She brought forward the written confirmation found in Croft's own filed notes from the night of the blood census, proving that the gold-silver flame result had been observed, recorded, and then immediately sealed. It was a secondary falsification she had not anticipated finding, and it added an immense amount of evidentiary weight to the pile sitting before them. When she finally finished speaking, the council chamber fell into a specific kind of silence. The absolute quiet of desperate people who have entirely run out of defensive positions to retreat to, waiting to see where the next blow will land. It was Gideon who ultimately raised the final, critical issue. Not because she lacked the ability to do so, but because he chose to raise it first, an act she had not expected from him. The fact that he stepped forward to say it was something she filed away carefully for later thought. "The marriage binding," Gideon said, his deep voice perfectly neutral, carrying none of the massive emotional weight the word truly deserved. "Made between myself and the princess." Royal law explicitly prohibits binding contracts between direct bloodline members and their sworn protectors without court overview. The original intent of the statute was to prevent bitter inheritance disputes, but the letter of the law is far broader. It requires an immediate, formal dissolution. Elder Croft confirmed the point with a quiet nod. The binding would need to be formally annulled. Both parties would be legally required to appear before the neutral court within exactly 30 days of the issue being raised. 30 days. The entire room waited in breathless suspense. Lyra looked down at the documents spread across the timber table. She looked at the portrait, studying her mother's regal face, her own face, and the innocent infant she had once been. Caught in a fleeting moment before everything was ruthlessly decided for her by powerful men, she finally looked at Gideon. He was looking right back at her. It was that same steady, completely unmanaged attention, no performance, no political direction, no waiting her out. He was simply entirely present for her. Neither of them spoke a word to break the silence. The 30-day countdown began right then and there, yet neither of them made a single move toward the exit. She really should have anticipated what came next. In complete fairness to herself, she actually had. She had considered, during the quiet, pre-dawn hours immediately following the intense council meeting, that an ambitious leader like Darian would never simply accept the total suspension of his Alpha Prime bid without attempting one final, desperate maneuver. She knew him inside and out. She had spent 6 long years studying the exact architecture of how he moved whenever he found himself cornered. Darian did not concede. He did not retreat. He specialized in redirecting the narrative, reframing the argument, and launching a vicious attack from an entirely unexpected angle that forced his opponent onto unfamiliar ground. What she had fundamentally underestimated was his timing. He made his move on the 3rd day of the summit's formal proceedings, during the massive open session convened in the Great Hall at full attendance. Every single court member, every high-ranking summit delegate, every pack elder, warrior representative, and diplomatic observer who had traveled to the estate under the banner of neutral court authority was packed into the room. It was the largest possible audience assembled in the grandest possible space. Lyra was forced to admit in the cold, analytical part of her mind that assessed military tactics regardless of personal stakes,
that the setting was brilliantly chosen.
Darien rose aggressively during the designated open address period, the summit's formal time for public challenges and grand declarations. He did it perfectly, procedurally, with the sharp precision of a man who had prepared his toxic language carefully and knew the exact legal framework within which he was operating.
I hereby invoke the right of formal challenge,
Darien announced, his arrogant voice echoing off the high stone rafters. Under Article 9 of the Neutral Court Summit Protocols, I bring forth a formal challenge to the legitimacy of evidence recently presented in closed council, and a direct challenge to the standing of an individual whose sudden claim to identity within this high court remains,
in my professional assessment, entirely unverified and politically motivated.
The hall's immense ambient noise dropped to absolutely nothing. The silence was instantaneous, the collective reaction of a room that had been waiting for a scandal and recognized its violent arrival. Gideon, seated firmly at the head of the Royal Assembly, said absolutely nothing. His rugged expression remained locked in the absolute stillness Lyra had come to recognize as his own unique form of response. A terrifying stillness that was never to be mistaken for passivity.
It was the predatory stillness of a warrior who had decided to let his enemy play out their hand completely, to the bitter end. Lyra was seated exactly 3 positions to Gideon's right. It was the prominent place that had been quietly assigned to her since the morning after the private council meeting, when the court's senior staff had quietly and without public announcement begun adjusting the seating arrangements to reflect a royal reality they had not yet formally confirmed, but were already treating as settled fact. She felt the entire hall's burning attention move toward her like a heavy physical weight. She looked directly at Darien and simply waited. He turned his back slightly to address the crowded room rather than speaking to her. It was another well-chosen tactical decision, framing her as the passive subject of his address rather than its recipient, deliberately diminishing her royal standing through the clever grammar of how he positioned his body. The individual currently presented to this high court as the lost heir, Darien declared, his voice dripping with practiced skepticism, arrived at this estate a mere 3 days ago as nothing more than a commoner woman with whom I had formally and legally severed a mate bond under Iron Veil Pack law. Yet within 48 hours of that public severance, convenient blood records were suddenly produced. A lost portrait was miraculously located, and an erased census document was presented, all of which have been kept exclusively within the archive under total control of this court for the entirety of their existence. He paused dramatically, letting the implications sink deep into the minds of the listening delegates. I am not openly suggesting administrative incompetence, Darien continued, a sharp smile touching his lips. I am, however, raising the critical question of whether evidence held exclusively by an interested party, produced conveniently at the exact psychological moment that party requires it to claim a throne, constitutes actual verification or deliberate political construction. He let the heavy silence do the destructive work he had designed it to accomplish. I am further raising the question to this assembly, Darien shouted, turning his gaze across the crowd, of whether a commoner woman who desperately proposed marriage to a high court warrior within mere hours of her pack severance, A woman possessing known political acumen and 6 years of rigorous experience in pack governance might have simply seen a golden opportunity for power and pursued it with the exact same ruthless discipline she applied to every other advantage she cultivated inside my pack. The stone sanctuary fell into a profound, suffocating silence. The echoes of Darian's cutting accusations hung in the heavy air, vibrating against the ancient lichen inscriptions etched along the high walls. Lyra kept her gaze fixed on Darian for a long moment. She did not flinch, nor did she let the coldness of his betrayal register on her face. Instead, she slowly surveyed the crowded expanse of the great hall. She watched the shifting expressions of the neutral court observers, men and women who had traveled across territories only to find themselves caught in the middle of a political execution. She saw the Iron Veil pack members lining the perimeter, their faces a turbulent mix of suppressed fury, calculating opportunism, and professional blankness. Finally, her eyes moved to Gideon, the feared warrior, the man the entire kingdom whispered about in terrified tones, was not looking at the crowd. He was not looking at Darian. His piercing silver eyes were locked entirely on her. In that unyielding gaze, devoid of any spoken words, a message passed between them with absolute, undeniable clarity. This battlefield is yours. I will not take your vengeance from you. Lyra stood up. The scraping of her chair against the stone floor sounded like a cracking sheet of ice in the quiet room. She had not intended to release the beast within her today. That was the absolute truth of the matter. What occurred next was not a rehearsed performance, nor was it a tactical maneuver she had held in reserve to maximize her political leverage. It was simply the exact threshold where her physical body made an absolute decision that her conscious mind had not yet articulated. She walked away from the long council table, stepping into the wide, empty circle at the absolute center of the great hall. And then she simply let go. The transformation, when it tore through the room, bore no resemblance to the agonizing, fractured shifts she had endured during her years of exile. There was no desperate wrestling against a suppressed nature, no painful grinding of bones trying to fit into a mold too small for them. It was instantaneous, absolute, and entirely painless, functioning like an ancient, heavy vault door thrown open from both sides at the exact same instant. A brilliant, blinding gold erupted first. It was a warm, cascading fire, the exact hue of the ancient dynasty census flame, rushing outward from the very core of her being. Then came the silver, threading through the gold with cool, razor-sharp precision and absolute certainty. The two royal colors intertwined beautifully, instantly recognizable to every single soul who had witnessed the sacred fire burning in this very chamber 3 days prior. Her wolf form was immense. She had not anticipated the sheer, overwhelming scale of her own inheritance. The old high fantasy texts always noted that the true rulers of the Light Dynasty possessed substantial, awe-inspiring forms. But reading the parchment and standing in the flesh were entirely different realities. She held her ground in the center of the stone hall. The grand architecture of the room seemed to bend to accommodate her massive presence. She did not snarl. She did not advance on her enemies. She performed no action that could be interpreted as a raw threat or mindless aggression. She simply existed, a towering manifestation of gold and silver, mirroring the sacred dynastic flame, present, undeniable, and entirely without apology. The stillness within the fortress walls became absolute. It lingered for a torturous, an elongated moment, the kind of suspended collective breath a room takes when a dispute transitions from empty argument into irrefutable, living evidence. Then, from the dark shadows at the back of the hall, a distinct sound broke the quiet. It was the rustle of heavy, expensive fabric shifting, followed by the dull thud of armor hitting stone. An elder council member, his hair stark white and his movements precise, dropped heavily to one knee. The submission spread across the room. It did not move in a theatrical, coordinated wave, but rather like a slow fire catching dry wood. One by one, unhurried and deeply personal, each noble and warrior made their own internal calculation, reaching their own individual moment of terrifying recognition. Another elder bowed his head. Two high court dignitaries followed. The elderly head of the household staff, the very woman who had whispered of a lost daughter returning 3 days ago, sank to the floor, finally able to show her true allegiance openly. The battle-hardened warriors guarding the far wall lowered their weapons, dropping one after another with the practical, straightforward acceptance of soldiers who had assessed a supreme power and reached the only logical conclusion. Darian stood entirely alone. He did not kneel. Lyra had never expected him to bend his proud neck, nor did she desire his submission. Such a gesture would have cost him a shred of dignity she had absolutely no interest in extracting from him. She watched him stand isolated within the rapidly thinning circle of his own political ambitions, and she felt an emotion she had not anticipated. It was not a sense of wild satisfaction, nor was it a burning triumph. It was something far quieter, an emotion that verged briefly on pity before hardening into the simple, a clinical acknowledgement that a long, agonizing chapter of her life had finally concluded. Darian looked at her. For the first time in 6 years, he truly looked at the woman he had discarded. The practiced charisma and political performance were completely stripped away, leaving behind nothing but a man staring at the ruins of his own short-sighted choices. Then he looked away. The shift back to her human form was as effortless as the transition had been. Lyra stood in the center of the hall, breathing the cool air into her lungs, anchored entirely in her own skin. Neva broke away from the noble ranks without a single announcement. She walked the entire length of the stone hall with the measured, flawless composure of an aristocrat who had spent weeks calculating a decision she was finally ready to execute. She came to a halt directly beside Lyra. Not a step behind her, but shoulder to shoulder, making the political alignment perfectly legible to everyone watching in the gallery. Neva did not address the gathered court. She did not perform for the cameras or the council. She merely leaned toward Lyra, speaking in a voice so low and controlled that the rest of the hall could not catch a single syllable. Lyra listened intently. Her facial expression remained a mask of perfect discipline. She possessed far too much training to break now. Yet, something profound shifted in the depths of her eyes. A sharp flash of recognition that those standing closest would spend years trying to properly define. She looked at Neva for a long moment after the words ceased. Then she gave a single, firm nod, private, genuine, and absolute. The hall watched the silent exchange in rapt fascination. And that very lack of hearing made the weight of whatever passed between the two women feel far more devastating than any loud declaration. The great summit concluded without further ceremony. That had been Lyra's explicit mandate, and Gideon had enforced it ruthlessly. There were no grand closing speeches, no lavish celebratory banquets, and no structured moments designed to document what had occurred for the royal historians. The foreign delegates packing the estate departed over the span of 3 days, slipping away quietly into the misty forests. The palace staff returned the grand halls to their ordinary, quiet rhythms with the practiced efficiency of people who had lived through enough regime changes to know that true history rarely required golden decorations. Darian departed the territory on the second morning. He was not led out under an armed guard. That specific mercy had been Lyra's personal command, a choice that had deeply shocked the council elders. She offered no grand explanation to her court, saving her reasoning for the formal legal brief she filed with the neutral observers. In that document, she cleanly separated the systemic harms of the original Pact Covenant from Darian's personal criminal culpability. The judicial judgment she demanded focused strictly on the falsification of border reports, the deliberate concealment of a sealed royal agreement for personal political gain, and the misappropriation of ancestral succession capital. She did not demand his execution. She did not demand his exile. She demanded accountability, the specific, unglamorous, procedural kind that forced an arrogant alpha to sit before an independent tribunal, answer exhaustive questions, have his words permanently recorded, and watch his bid for higher leadership be suspended indefinitely. It was the kind of justice that did not make for a thrilling tavern ballad, but it was, in her tactical assessment, the only kind that actually held the foundations of a kingdom together. She watched his carriage roll through the heavy iron gates from the high window of the east corridor. As the iron bars clicked shut, she felt the final stubborn knot in her chest unravel completely. It was not forgiveness. Perhaps she would never possess that in any complete sense. But the exhausting weight of carrying someone else's low estimate of her worth for 6 long years was finally gone. She let it drop into the mud outside. The absence of that weight left a massive, clean space inside her spirit that she was only beginning to fully comprehend. The heavy oak door to the east wing stood wide open now. The ancient ward of closure that had sealed the rooms for over a decade dissolved entirely the morning after the council meeting. It had passed away gradually, as though the magic itself had been waiting for absolute confirmation of her identity before letting go, allowing the sealed seams to separate cleanly. What lay within those rooms was exactly what she had anticipated, yet nothing she could have truly prepared her heart to face. It was a sanctuary, preserved with the heartbreaking, meticulous care of servants who had maintained their loyalty long past the point where hope was rational. She found her biological mother's personal belongings, rows of leather-bound books, and a polished wooden box containing old correspondence written in an elegant, flowing handwriting that Lyra did not recognize, but spent 3 entire days reading line by line. Beneath the letters lay an infant's blanket, stark white and folded with perfect geometric precision. kept pristine long after any practical reason for its existence had vanished. She spent hours in those rooms every single day since the seals broke. It was not an exercise in pure grief, but rather an introduction. She was meeting a tragic queen she would never truly know through the silent evidence left behind. Assembling a portrait from beautiful, fragmented memories that would always contain painful gaps. It was incomplete, and it was permanent, and she was learning how to hold both of those truths in her hands simultaneously. The grand portrait of the Light Dynasty's fallen monarch had been rehung on the main wall of the East Corridor. Every time Lyra walked beneath it, the stone sconces automatically flared with brilliant gold and silver flames. She had stopped viewing the magic as a strange occurrence. It had begun to feel like exactly what it was, an ancient house recognizing its own bloodline. Gideon found her in the quiet sanctuary of the East Wing on a crisp morning 3 weeks after the summit had officially closed. She was sitting quietly in the deep stone window seat at the very end of the long gallery, looking out over the sprawling valley where the kingdom sat in its permanent, unhurried way. The autumn sunlight streamed through the leaded glass at a low, sharp angle, turning the dust motes into floating amber and illuminating the sharp lines of the landscape. She heard him approaching long before he reached her. She always recognized his movements now, having memorized the specific, heavy cadence of his footsteps, even, unhurried, and deliberate. She did not turn her head immediately as he entered. Gideon settled his massive frame into the high-backed wooden chair positioned across from her window seat. He did so with the quiet ease of a warrior who had decided a long time ago that waiting in the shadows was not the same thing as losing the battle. They remained in the silence for a long time. It was a comfortable, grounded quiet that was still new enough to feel remarkable to her. "You never told me," Gideon said eventually, his deep voice cutting through the stillness of the room. "What?" Lyra murmured, keeping her gaze on the amber horizon. She had been quietly waiting for him to ask this specific question. She had been carrying the weight of Neva's whispered words for 3 weeks, not as a dark secret or a withheld weapon, but as a sacred truth that required the perfect moment to be spoken aloud. It needed the quiet of the East Wing, the amber light, and the royal portrait hanging visible at the end of the long gallery. She finally turned her head to look directly at him. "She told me that our mother chose my true name before I was smuggled out of the palace," Lyra said, her voice remaining steady and quiet in the vast room. She said she explicitly begged Neva's family to remember the name, to keep it alive in their secret records, just in case the lineage ever needed to be pulled from the ashes. She paused, taking a slow breath. She said that in the high language of the old empire, the name Lyra translates directly to "she who returns." The long corridor became completely motionless. Gideon stared at her, his silver eyes unblinking. She watched him receive the words, watching a profound emotion move through his rugged features, an emotion he did not attempt to manage, suppress, or redirect. He simply allowed it to wash across his face the way a heavy storm passes over open, rocky country. His strong jaw tightened. His eyes grew incredibly bright, bearing the look of a man fighting to hold something immense back. Not out of a desire for cold suppression, but out of the sheer physical effort required to contain a feeling far too large for the space available inside his chest.
She knew, Lyra whispered softly, her eyes locked onto his. She named me for the absolute hope of this very day. Yes, Gideon said, his voice dropping to a gravelly low register that vibrated in the stone room. She was right. He looked at her for another long, unbroken moment. Then, quietly, he repeated, yes, she absolute was. The formal proposal to completely restructure the legal framework of the royal binding had been officially submitted to the neutral court a week after the summit's conclusion. Lyra had drafted every single line of the legal document herself, working deep into the night hours, just as she had drafted almost every piece of legislation in the busy weeks since her ascension. She had found, to her own mild amusement, that governing an entire kingdom required the exact same methodical precision, tireless discipline, and tactical acumen. She had spent 6 years performing invisibly for a pack that never valued her labor. The only fundamental difference now was that her own name was signed at the bottom of the parchment. The core principle of her proposal was elegant in its simplicity, yet highly complex in its legal application. It dictated that any marriage or pact bond entered into freely and in good faith, regardless of any massive legal or identity complications subsequently uncovered, could be reviewed by the High Court. The review would not be for an automatic, cold annulment, but rather for a process of voluntary confirmation. It established the precedent that a bond initiated in total ignorance of true identity could still be honored by the conscious choice of the individuals involved. It is, the senior advisor of the neutral court had informed her with a look of intense diplomatic neutrality, entirely unprecedented in our legal history. She had calmly informed the advisor that she was well aware of that fact. The legislation was currently grinding its way through the labyrinthine review process of the high courts, moving with the unhurried, the glacial pace of judicial bodies that had operated for centuries and saw absolutely no reason to accelerate their protocols for the convenience of individuals. In the meantime, her own binding to Gideon existed in a state of formal procedural suspension, neither legally confirmed nor officially dissolved. Neither she nor Gideon had uttered a single word regarding the standard 30-day dissolution window since their intense meeting in the council chambers. The 30 days had officially lapsed yesterday. Neither of them had acknowledged that milestone either. Gideon asked her the question on a morning that was entirely indistinguishable from any other. There was no grand occasion, no dramatic framing, and absolutely nothing that marked the moment as an event being manufactured for historical significance. He simply looked at her as she sat in the East Wing window seat, the warm amber light cutting a path between them. "Will you stay?" he asked. The question was not delivered as a king demanding a princess, nor was it a warrior commanding a subordinate. The complex roles they inherited were very real, and Lyra had already made her internal peace with the convoluted shape of them. Their situation was unprecedented, requiring a completely new vocabulary that the existing legal frameworks simply failed to provide. But those titles were not what he was truly invoking in the quiet room. Lyra looked back at him, her mind tracking back to the night their paths had truly altered. "Why did you say yes to me?" she asked, her voice echoing the exact question she had thrown at him in the driving rain. Gideon had been entirely prepared for the question. She had known he would be ready, recognizing that he had been carrying his true answer in his heart, the exact same way she had been carrying Neva's whispered words.
merely waiting for the right corridor, the right light, and the right moment of peace. "Because," Gideon said, his silver eyes locking onto hers with absolute intensity, "you were the single, solitary person in this entire kingdom who had ever asked me for something without knowing exactly what my title could give them." Lyra held those words in her mind. She turned them over carefully, the way she analyzed every complex tactical problem, viewing the statement from every possible angle to ensure its absolute integrity. Gideon had been forced into the role of the feared executioner, the brutal enforcer, since he was a young man. He had spent his entire life being negotiated with by deceptive elders, petitioned by desperate pacts, courted by ambitious noble houses, deferred to out of cold fear, and hated for the dark duties he performed to keep the realm stable. People had handed him gifts, loyalty, and false smiles exclusively in exchange for the immense power they desired from him. Long before he was old enough to truly understand the transactional nature of his existence. And then a broken woman had appeared out of the mud and the driving rain, stripped of her pack, furious, dangerous, and entirely undisguised. She had demanded the one thing that absolutely no person possessing full information would have ever thought to ask him for. She had demanded a choice, made freely, offering him absolutely nothing in return, gaining no political advantage, and possessing zero knowledge of the massive royal burden he carried beneath his scarred armor. She understood completely. "I will stay," Lyra said. She did not say it because she owed him a debt of survival. She did not say it because the ancient magical binding required her compliance, nor because the current political climate of the territory suggested it was the safest path forward. She did not even say it because the grand portrait hanging at the end of the corridor proved she belonged in this palace by right of blood. She chose to stay because every single massive decision she had made in her adult life had been executed in silent service of someone else's future, someone else's wealth, and someone else's pack. This was the absolute first decision she was making entirely, unapologetically, for herself. She stayed because she chose to. Outside the heavy glass, the ancient valley held the kingdom in its permanent, unhurried embrace. The stone sconces down the length of the east corridor continued to burn with steady flames of gold and silver. The massive oak door at the very end of the royal wing stood wide open, exactly as it would remain from this day forward. And in the quiet of an ordinary morning that required absolutely no grand ceremony, the lost daughter, who had always been she who returns, had finally come home.